Before I jump into the Torah, I should say that we are meeting on a quite an unusual morning, or following a very unusual day, let us say, in the world, and certainly in the United States. And obviously, I've been commenting, for those of you who are interested, on Twitter and on Facebook, and I sent out a letter to the congregation. I am not going to talk about it this morning, just because I think we all have access to endless commentary about that. And as I say, I will be speaking more about it, I'm sure, on Shabbat morning at the sermon. Let me just pause to say that I am pleased to note that at the end of the day, the Congress reconvened and the election was nonetheless certified, which suggests that it is possible to override the disturbances and the foolishness and the cruelty of some people with the order and sense and goodness that is far deeper in this country. So that's good to know. All right, let's go to the Torah. And this morning in the Torah, we are reading from Parshat Shmot. That is the beginning of the book of Exodus. And this is one of those cases where the story gives an embarrassment of riches. That is, some parashot you come to and you say, what do I say about this parsha? But the first few chapters of the book of Shmot in particular, leading up to probably the 20th chapter of the Ten Commandments and even Mishpatim following it, there's so much that one could say. And so the question is, instead of trying to find something to say, how do you limit yourself and choose a topic? And what I want to choose, at least, it's something that I'm sure we'll return to in other contexts, but what I want to choose is the choice of Moses. Because such choices seem inevitable in retrospect, but as we have discovered, the choice of a leader is monumental in a nation and for a nation, and has profound consequences for good and sometimes for ill, and therefore we have to look at the selection of Moshe and try to understand what it is that it means and what it is that we can learn from this selection in order to both follow the progress of Moshe and the people through the Torah, but also understand what it means for ourselves in our own selection of leadership on all sorts of levels, in all sorts of organizations and structures. So it's clear, first of all, that Moses, like many leaders, has a sort of initial enunciation. That is, there's something special about him from the beginning, because obviously his birth and salvation are noted, which is not true of anyone else at this period. But his parents are not named for the first 6 chapters of the book of Shmot. It says in chapter 2 of the book of Exodus, a certain man of the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. That's it. Some guy married some woman. Now, one of the lessons that I think you can learn from this is that excellence can arise from anywhere. It's just a guy and a woman had a kid, and it turned out to be Moses. And that tells us that it is not necessarily that, Cleopatra and Caesar have to mate. as they apparently did, and had a kid who was killed by Mark Antony, but that's another story. But it's not as though two major figures have to find one another, or by Pompey, have to find one another to mate in order to create somebody who is exceptional. That remarkable people can arise from anywhere. Abraham Lincoln's parents were illiterates, and he turned out to be Abraham Lincoln. Now, they may have been exceptional people, but so could the random person from the tribe of Levite. The man or the woman be an exceptional person, and she has a son. She sees that he's a beautiful child. She hides him. And when she could hide him no longer, she takes her chances by putting him in a wicker basket and setting him on the Nile. Now, when Pharaoh's daughter rather, goes down to the Nile to find, not for the purpose of finding, but Anne finds the basket. First of all, the basket there is called a teva, which means an ark. And that is a word that is also used for Noah. The one gives a physical salvation and the other a spiritual salvation. So in both, the teva is going to save a people, in one case, a world. And when she goes down there, it says that she sees a child crying. V'hinei, and behold, na'ar bocheh. And she says this must be a Hebrew child. Now, why does she know it's a Hebrew child? You can think of a range of explanations. One, because who else would hide their child in a basket on the Nile, right? It was the Hebrew children that were under the sign of death that were being killed. Two, because perhaps he was circumcised. And that was unusual enough that she saw that and figured it must be a Hebrew child. Three, and this is the one that I want to pursue. Three, because the idea of a child being seen crying and not heard crying, this sort of strangled cry, or this cry stopped up in the depths of his heart, as one rabbi put it, is because if Moses cries out loud, he's going to be killed. So he doesn't cry out loud, although how as a 3-month-old he knows that is miraculous. But it also gives us a signal that Moses has a problem with articulation. Moses does not speak the way he is supposed to speak. And we can see that because, behold, a child crying. She sees him crying and doesn't hear him crying. And the reason that that's important is that this idea will pursue Moses throughout his life. Lo ish devarim anochi. I'm not a man of words, he says to God. I'm kvad peh and kvad lashon. I'm heavy of speech and heavy of tongue. And the idea that Moshe is unable to speak properly has so many implications that I want to explore one or two of them and speak then about a couple of other aspects of Moses's life that are important for his selection to be the leader of Israel. First of all, it means that Moshe will not be subject to the glib fluency of people to whom words come easily. People for whom words come easily tend much more easily to say things they don't really mean because they don't have to work to get it out. Every fleeting thought finds itself in some bubble of articulation. But if you have to actually work to say words, as I saw, for example, with my mother when she became a phasic, she would only try to say things she really needed to say, and very often she would just wave it away like it's not worth the struggle. And Moses, who had to struggle to produce words, would produce those words that he knew actually mattered. That's one important lesson of his battle with his own capacities. Second, the idea that Moses was himself wounded, was hurt, was scarred, is something that we find in leaders again and again and again. You see it in even leaders who have had, in some ways, good fortune in their lives. Churchill, who grew up in a very wealthy family and a very renowned family, and yet his parents were cold and distant. And not only were his parents cold and distant, but also he himself suffered from depression. And part of the crucible in which a soul is formed is that difficulty and pain that shapes a leader. I know that there are questions coming in. When I finish my initial presentation, I'll address some of the questions. The other part of this is that Moses's woundedness tends to give him a greater sympathy with people who are oppressed, who are beleaguered, who are, in his case, enslaved. Because the second of three traits that I want to point out about Moses, the first, his being wounded, is the second is his empathy. Because it says in verse 11, Moses grew up, and he walked out to see to his kinsfolk. And what does Moses see when he walks out into Egypt? It doesn't say, and he saw magnificent pyramids. It doesn't say he saw beautiful buildings. It says he saw their sufferings or their labors. These bulls saw this to both work and also to suffer. So Moses has an instinctive gene of empathizing with people who are unfortunate. Moses walks out into Los Angeles and sees the homeless. He doesn't see the Hollywood sign. And that ability is going to be crucial, obviously, because if Moses doesn't feel the depths and the sufferings of Israel, he will not be able to sustain the continued sympathy and drive that will be required in order for him to liberate them and to carry them through the desert. Since I don't want to give away too much of the Torah before we get there, but let me just assure you, it is not an easy task. So, third, in addition to Moses' being wounded and his having an instinctive sympathy for Israel, the third is the actions that we do know that Moses took before God comes to him at the burning bush. What happens when Moses comes out? The first thing he sees is an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, and presumably beating him badly. So what does he do? He strikes the Egyptian and buries him in the sand. First, he looks around to make sure nobody sees. And when it says nobody sees, the drash that the rabbis give is, it says, Vayar ki ein ish. He saw there was no man. And they hearken back or forward, depending on which chronology you use, to Hillel's comment, in a place where there are no men, try to be a man. In other words, try to be an adult, a grown-up person, a mensch. And they say, well, it's not that that nobody was there, but Moses saw that nobody was taking action. That's one possibility. The other possibility, of course, is that literally no one was around. And so what he does is he kills the Egyptian, his taskmaster, hides his body, and then later he intervenes in a fight between two Israelites. And one of them instead of saying, thank you for intervening in our fight and trying to make peace, says, what, are you going to kill me the way you killed that Egyptian? And Moses now knows that it is known. Now, as some commentators have remarked, if in fact no one was around and it was known, the only person who could have told of it was the person Moses saved, which means that even the people that Moses saves do not protect him. And this certainly proves to be true with the Israelites as Moses takes them through the desert, right? He saves them again and again, and they give him nothing but surus, trouble. And so Moses is put upon in a serious way. That's the third. Oh, I have to. The third. I want to tell you the third incident in Moses' life after he strikes the Egyptian and after he intervenes in the quarrel with the two Israelites. So then he runs away to Midian because he's afraid to stay in Egypt. Now there's a price on his head, he believes, and he goes to Midian and he sits down beside a well. Why a well? Again and again, you see this in the Torah, because a well is the gathering place. That's where everybody has to come sooner or later. You've got to have water. Since you have to have water, you have to go to the well. So Moses sits down by the well. The priest of Midian, who has daughters, they go to draw water and to fill their troughs, but shepherds came and drove them off. Moses rose to their defense and watered the flock. So now he has intervened in a quarrel in Midian. But as many of the commentators have pointed out, what Moshe has done is he's intervened in three different kinds of fights. One, between an Egyptian and a Jew, Israelite. Two, a quarrel between two Israelites. And three, a quarrel between two non-Jews. Therefore, you get the sense from the very little that we know about Moses before he becomes Moses, that he is somebody who is obsessed with justice, no matter who is being unjust. Doesn't matter. Can be an Israelite and can be an Egyptian who's being unjust to an Israelite, can be two Israelites, can be two non-Jews. Whoever it is, Moses wants to make it right. And so when God comes to Moshe, what we already know is here is somebody who is wounded, and I will return to that because I saw that one of you asked why not disabled, why wounded, but I'll come back to why I say wounded and not just disabled. Someone who is wounded, someone who is empathetic because he sees the sufferings of his people, and someone who is obsessed with justice. And those qualities together make it probable that when God chooses Moshe, he's going to choose somebody who will be up to the task. Now, the Midrash, that is rabbinic stories about Moses, emphasize these qualities. One of the most famous stories is that Moshe was pasturing the sheep of his father-in-law Jethro. Remember the daughters of the priest of Midian, whom he saved at the well. One of them turned out to be, they turned out to be the daughter of Jethro. He marries one, Zipporah, and becomes Jethro's son-in-law. So he's pasturing his father-in-law's sheep, and one of them runs away. And Moses runs after it for a long time till the sheep was, until he found it, drinking by a stream of water. He said, had I known you were thirsty, I would have walked you by a stream. When the sheep finishes drinking, Moses lifts it up on his shoulders and carries it back to the flock. And when God sees that, he says, that's my leader. Because as the Midrash tells us, when God wants to choose a leader, he looks to see how they tend sheep. In other words, how they treat those who are powerless, hopeless, in trouble, oppressed. And therefore, many of the leaders of Israel, Jacob, David, Moses, were shepherds. And this makes Moshe especially empathetic and enables us to understand from still a different point of view why God chooses Moses. One more characteristic I want to point out about Moshe, and then I'm going to get to the questions that have been asked thus far. And please feel free to keep writing in questions either on Facebook, on YouTube, on whatever mode we're trying to get them all. The other characteristic of Moshe that we learn about when God comes to Moses at the burning bush is that he doesn't want the job. Now, this to us in modern America seems to be a very bad qualification for a job. If you walk into the office and say, I'm here to interview for this job, but I'd like you to know I don't want it, you're liable to be told, well, then don't interview and don't take the job. However, first of all, I think it's fair to say that God is not a typical job interview. God doesn't ask for resumes, doesn't give you an MMPI, doesn't call other references. Instead, God has a sense that this is the right person. And part of what God is looking for is that Moshe should be humble. To have a sense of destiny and still be humble, that's the very unusual combination that is going to be required for Moshe to carry this people through the wilderness. If he thinks I'm great and there's nothing like me, I'm the best thing in the world, then that arrogance will make it impossible for him to bear the kinds of things he has to bear. But if he, on the one hand, knows that he is the servant of a cause far greater than he, and of a God far greater than he, and can subordinate himself to that greater cause, and still have a sense of tremendous destiny and certainty about what he can do, that's the person. So he makes every excuse he can. I don't talk right. The people won't listen to me. Choose someone else, when God says to him, you're going. And from the moment that happens, although Moses complains on occasion about having been chosen, he never shirks a second of his duty. He never goes back on it. He never shrinks from it. His strength is monumental and awesome, and awesome in the traditional meaning of that word. That is, it evokes awe in those who behold it. Now, let me go back to some of the questions. First of all, an easy one, Jethro, Ruel, Hobab. According to the rabbinic tradition, those are all different names. The priest of Midian had multiple names, as many people did at that time, but they're all considered to be the same. Second, why do I use the word wounded instead of using the word disabled? And the reason that I use wounded is I'm not only referring to Moses' speech impediment. I'm referring to the fact that he grows up without a family. Don't forget. He grows up in the palace, but he may have his mother as a wet nurse, but he doesn't have a father at all. The fact that he has to run away from home because of his pursuit of justice, that he is all alone in Midian without anybody whom he knows, right? This is somebody who has clearly suffered and who is wounded in many ways. So I think that it's fair to say that Moses is a wounded soul, like most great people, and a lot of people who aren't great. And also to get through this life without being wounded, I think you have to be unhealthy. How about that? I'll just leave it at that. Then the other question that I saw before was the question of hineni and hine and behold, and does that necessarily mean that Pharaoh's daughter saw him but didn't hear him? It doesn't necessarily mean that she didn't hear him. And hine is behold. That's what it means. Hine is presentational. So when it says Hine bar na'ar bocheh, it means the literal translation is behold a child crying. Although na'ar is generally used for an older, not for an infant, which is another interesting thing. I mean, the Midrash again plays with that and says when it says Hine na'ar bocheh, it's talking about Aaron. That Aaron was the one who was crying because Aaron was a na'ar. Moses was just quiet in the crib. That's another possible interpretation. But however, having said that, when it says Hine na'ar bocheh, it's clearly referring to sight. It could be that she heard Moses, but I think that we are entitled to interpret the unusual phrase that doesn't refer at all to hearing, because that's the way the Torah puts it. So I don't want to assume she heard, and put words in the Torah's mouth, even though we do that all the time. When Jennifer asks if ki tov necessarily means beautiful, no, ki tov means good in any sense that you want to use good. It was a good baby. He was a beautiful baby. He was an extraordinary baby. Whatever it is, it's undefined what ki tov means, and you can decide what it means for you. But I think that it is important that the model of leadership that we get here is a model of leadership that suggests that that Moses is someone who was fashioned in a certain way. I'll come to what Janet wrote in just a second because that ties into this. Fashioned in a certain way such that he was exemplary, of exemplary characteristics to be able to be the leader of Israel. Psalm 139, which is the psalm that speaks about God knowing someone from their womb, it may suggest and could suggest, although the rabbis have it both ways with this, that God chooses people even before they're born. Or you could say if God gives free will, then God waits to see what kind of life you lead before God chooses you. I can't settle that, and neither can anyone else. I have no idea what God's criteria is. It does seem in the Torah that some people earn their leadership, like Isaiah, who says, choose me, literally, and that other people like Samson in particular are designated as leaders from before birth. But that is a mystery to which I was not given the keys, so I won't pronounce on it definitively one way or another. And Baruch Ben David just asked pretty much the question that I was responding to, that is, did God know early on that Moses was going to be the leader? And again, this goes to God's foreknowledge and to human free will, which is a difficult philosophical question, which Rabbi Akiva responded to but did not answer by saying, Hakol tzafui v'reshut netuna. Everything is foreseen and free will is granted. How you reconcile that paradox is certainly a question for another time, and I'm not sure that anybody can, but we can at least make a few stabs at it. Nonetheless, it is within our province to suggest that Moses was chosen because of who Moses became on his own. That had Moses not worked to be the person that he became, God would not have chosen him. I have elaborated on this somewhat in my Jerusalem Post column this week, my Torah column, which you can find. It's on Twitter. It will be on Facebook shortly, or at the Jerusalem Post website. Or those of you who get Off the Pulpit, it will be at the top of the Off the Pulpit column for this week, which goes out today. You should get it by the end of the day. But it is an infinitely interesting question about Moses, and there's much more to say about Moses and speech. But let's leave it there for now. let us wish peace on our beautiful country. And I hope you have a Shabbat Shalom. Looking forward to see you on Shabbat morning. Take care.